Have you ever felt invisible? Like your struggles didn't matter, or no one truly saw the weight you were carrying? Imagine being abandoned by those you trusted most, left alone in a harsh desert with no hope in sight. This was Hagar's reality, a woman whose story begins in pain but ends in purpose. Her life wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy. Yet, her journey holds truths that resonate deeply with each of us today. What if I told you that even in your darkest moments, you are seen? That there is a God who notices every tear, every step, and every cry for help? Hagar discovered this truth when she least expected it. Alone and desperate, she encountered something extraordinary: divine intervention. An angel appeared to her, not just offering comfort, but revealing a promise so profound it would shape generations to come. Her son, Ishmael, became the father of a great nation, not because of his status or privilege, but because of God's faithfulness. And Hagar? She gave God a name we still remember today: El Roi, the God who sees. This isn't just an ancient story, it's a mirror reflecting our own lives, a reminder that even when we feel forgotten, we are never out of reach of God's love. So, what can we learn from Hagar's courage, her faith, and her redemption? Let's dive into her story together and uncover how it speaks directly to us today. Hagar's story begins in a world far removed from the comforts of privilege and security. She was an Egyptian servant, a woman whose life was defined by servitude and submission. Her identity was tied to her role as a handmaid, a position that left little room for autonomy or dignity. Yet, despite her lowly status, Hagar found herself thrust into a situation that would test her faith, resilience, and humanity. It all started with a decision made not by her, but by others: Sarah and Abram. Sarah, unable to bear children, offered Hagar to Abram as a surrogate. This act, though rooted in cultural norms of the time, carried profound implications for Hagar. She became a vessel, a means to fulfill someone else's longing for legacy. But what about her own desires, her own dreams, her own humanity? These questions were never considered. Instead, Hagar was reduced to a tool, an instrument in a plan she did not choose. The weight of this reality must have been crushing. At first, Hagar complied. Perhaps she saw no other option. Perhaps she hoped that bearing Abram's child would elevate her status, granting her a sense of worth and belonging. But as her pregnancy progressed, something shifted. Hagar began to see herself differently. She was no longer just a servant. She was carrying new life, a child who would carry her blood and her legacy. For the first time, she may have felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of purpose. But this newfound confidence came at a cost. Sarah noticed the change in Hagar. What had once been compliance now seemed like defiance. Sarah interpreted Hagar's behavior as arrogance, an affront to her authority. In response, she lashed out, subjecting Hagar to harsh treatment and emotional cruelty. The very woman who had placed Hagar in this impossible situation now punished her for the consequences of that decision. It was a cruel paradox, one that left Hagar feeling trapped and dehumanized. The pain became unbearable. The weight of rejection, the sting of mistreatment, and the suffocating loneliness pushed Hagar to make a drastic choice. She fled. Leaving behind the only home she had ever known, she ventured into the wilderness, a barren and unforgiving landscape. The desert stretched endlessly before her, mirroring the emptiness she felt within. Alone, pregnant, and desperate, Hagar must have wondered if there was any hope left for her. Did anyone truly care about her pain? Did anyone see her? In that moment, Hagar embodied the universal human experience of feeling unseen and unheard. How many of us have walked through seasons where we felt invisible, as though our struggles didn't matter? How many of us have questioned whether God notices our pain when life feels overwhelmingly unjust? Hagar's journey resonates because it reflects our own fears, doubts, and longings. It reminds us that even in our lowest moments, we are not alone. But here's the remarkable part of Hagar's story. Her flight into the wilderness was not the end. It was the beginning of a divine encounter that would forever change her life. Though she felt abandoned by everyone around her, God saw her. He pursued her. And in doing so, He revealed His heart, not just for Hagar, but for every person who has ever felt forgotten. This is where Hagar's story transitions from despair to hope, from invisibility to divine recognition. It's a reminder that God meets us in our darkest moments, offering comfort, guidance, and a promise that extends far beyond what we can imagine. Hagar's journey challenges us to reflect on how we treat others, especially those who occupy positions of vulnerability. Do we see them as people, or do we reduce them to roles and functions? Do we honor their humanity, or do we exploit their circumstances for our gain? Her story calls us to empathy, urging us to recognize the inherent worth of every individual, regardless of their station in life. It also invites us to trust in God's presence, even when the road ahead seems uncertain. After all, if God could meet Hagar in the wilderness, He can surely meet us wherever we are today. Hagar's struggles began in a place many of us know too well, the intersection of pain, rejection, and uncertainty. As an Egyptian servant, her identity was already shaped by her role as someone on the margins, someone whose worth was often tied to her utility rather than her humanity. But when Sarah and Abram decided to use her as a solution to their own longing for a child, Hagar's life took a turn she could never have anticipated. She became pregnant with Abram's child, a situation that should have brought her some measure of security or even honor. Instead, it became the catalyst for her suffering. Sarah's jealousy erupted into mistreatment, and Abram, though complicit in the decision, offered no protection. Feeling abandoned by those who should have cared for her, Hagar made the only choice she felt she had. She fled. The wilderness was harsh and unforgiving, a reflection of the turmoil within her heart. Alone, desperate, and carrying the weight of her unborn child, Hagar must have wondered if anyone truly saw her. Did anyone care about her pain? Was her life of any value beyond what others could extract from her? These are questions that resonate deeply with so many of us today. In moments when we feel unseen, unvalued, or discarded, it is easy to believe that our cries go unheard. Yet, it was in this very moment of despair that God entered Hagar's story, not with fanfare or grand gestures, but with quiet, intimate presence. An angel appeared to her, not to scold her for running away or to demand she return immediately, but to offer hope and reassurance. Hagar, servant of Sarai, the angel called her by name, acknowledging her identity and affirming her worth. Imagine the weight of hearing your name spoken in such a desolate place. For the first time, perhaps, Hagar realized she was not invisible. The angel reminded her of God's awareness of her plight, saying, "You are now with child and will have a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery." This was more than just a promise. It was a lifeline. God saw her pain, heard her cries, and had a plan for her future. What strikes me most about this encounter is its profound intimacy. God didn't wait for Hagar to come to him. He met her where she was, in the wilderness, in her brokenness. He didn't require her to clean herself up, prove her worth, or earn his favor. He simply showed up. And in doing so, he revealed something extraordinary about his character. He sees the overlooked, hears the unheard, and values the undervalued. This truth has the power to transform how we view ourselves and others. But the story doesn't end there. The angel also gave Hagar instructions. Go back to your mistress and submit to her. At first glance, this directive might seem harsh. Why would God ask her to return to a place of suffering? Yet, when we look closer, we see that this wasn't a call to endure abuse without purpose. It was an invitation to trust God's greater plan. By returning, Hagar positioned herself to witness the unfolding of his promises, not just for her, but for her son and future generations. This act of obedience required immense courage, yet it underscores a vital lesson. Trusting God often means stepping forward in faith, even when the path ahead seems uncertain. God's promise to Hagar was breathtaking in its scope. Her son, Ishmael, would become the father of a great nation, a legacy that would stretch far beyond her imagination. This assurance wasn't just for Hagar's benefit. It was a declaration that God's purposes extend to all people, regardless of their circumstances or status. Through Hagar, God demonstrated that no one is outside the reach of his love and plans. As I reflect on this part of Hagar's journey, I am reminded of the countless individuals throughout history, and even today, who find themselves in similar places of isolation and despair. Like Hagar, they may wonder if anyone sees them or cares about their pain. Yet, her story assures us that God does. He meets us in our wilderness moments, offering hope, guidance, and promises that transcend our understanding. This narrative invites us to consider how we respond to those around us who feel unseen or undervalued. Do we mirror God's compassion, or do we contribute to their sense of invisibility? Hagar's experience challenges us to be agents of his love, extending kindness and dignity to everyone we encounter. After all, every person carries a story, and every story matters to God. In the end, Hagar's encounter in the wilderness wasn't just about survival. It was about transformation. It was about discovering that she was seen, heard, and deeply loved by the Creator of the universe. And isn't that what we all long for? To know that we are not alone, that our lives have meaning, and that we are part of something greater than ourselves. Hagar's story reminds us that these desires are not in vain. God sees us, He hears us, and He is always at work, weaving beauty out of brokenness and purpose out of pain. Hagar's faith grew in ways that are both deeply personal and universally relatable. When she named God El Roi, meaning the God who sees, she wasn't just uttering words, she was declaring a profound truth about her experience. In that moment, Hagar realized something transformative. She mattered to God. Despite being an outsider, a servant, and someone who had been cast aside by those around her, God saw her pain, acknowledged her worth, and intervened in her life. This realization must have been overwhelming for her, but it also brought clarity and hope. It is a reminder to all of us that no matter how invisible we may feel in the eyes of others, or even in our own eyes, God sees us. He notices every tear, every struggle, and every cry for help. Imagine what it must have been like for Hagar in that wilderness. Alone, pregnant, and without resources, she faced not only physical exhaustion, but also emotional despair. She likely questioned everything: her purpose, her value, and whether anyone truly cared about her existence. Yet, in the midst of her darkest hour, God sent an angel to meet her where she was. The angel didn't scold her for running away or dismiss her feelings of abandonment. Instead, he spoke directly to her heart, offering guidance and reassurance. He told her to return to Sarah, yes, but more importantly, he gave her a promise that her son would become the father of a great nation. That promise wasn't just about Ishmael, it was about Hagar herself. It affirmed that her life had meaning, that her suffering was not in vain, and that God had a plan for her future. What strikes me most about this encounter is how intimate it feels. God didn't send a grand display of power or a booming voice from heaven. Instead, he came quietly, tenderly, meeting Hagar in her brokenness. This speaks volumes about the nature of God. He doesn't wait for us to be perfect or put together before he steps in. He meets us right where we are, in our mess, in our pain, in our doubt, and reminds us that we are loved and valued. And then there's the well. When God led Hagar to a source of water in the desert, it wasn't just a practical solution to her immediate need. It was symbolic of his provision in our lives. Just as he provided water for Hagar and her unborn child, he provides for us in ways we often don't recognize until later. Sometimes, his provision comes in the form of answered prayers, unexpected opportunities, or people who show up at just the right time. Other times, it's less tangible, but equally powerful. Peace in the midst of chaos, strength when we feel weak, or hope when all seems lost. For Hagar, the well was proof that God cared about her survival, her dignity, and her future. It was a tangible sign of his presence and faithfulness. This part of Hagar's story challenges me to think about my own relationship with God. How often do I overlook his provision because I'm too focused on what I lack? How many times has he met me in my wilderness moments, only for me to miss it because I was consumed by fear or self-pity? Hagar's example encourages me to look closer, to trust deeper, and to believe that God is always working behind the scenes, even when I can't see it. Her faith also inspires me to embrace gratitude in the face of adversity. Hagar could have stayed bitter about her circumstances. She could have allowed anger and resentment to define her. But instead, she chose to acknowledge God's presence and provision. By naming him El Roi, she turned her pain into praise. What a powerful lesson for all of us. When life feels heavy, we have a choice. We can focus on what's wrong, or we can choose to see how God is moving, even in the smallest ways. Ultimately, Hagar's story teaches us that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting God in the midst of uncertainty. It's about believing that he sees us, even when we feel unseen. And it's about holding on to hope, knowing that his plans for us are good, even if they unfold differently than we imagined. Hagar's journey reminds us that God uses ordinary people, people like her and like us, to accomplish extraordinary things. Her legacy is one of resilience, faith, and divine connection. May her story inspire us to seek God more fervently, trust him more fully, and live with the confidence that we are seen, loved, and never alone. Though Ishmael was not the promised heir, God's blessing upon him was profound and far-reaching. His story is a testament to the depth of God's love and the inclusivity of his plans. When we examine Ishmael's life, we see that God did not reserve his blessings solely for those who fit neatly into human expectations or predetermined roles. Instead, he extended his grace to Ishmael, affirming his worth and purpose in the grand narrative of faith. Ishmael's journey begins with tension and misunderstanding. As the son of Hagar and Abram, he entered a world fraught with complications. Sarah's decision to cast Hagar and her child out of their household placed Ishmael in a precarious position. Yet, even in this moment of rejection, God intervened. He assured Hagar that Ishmael would not only survive, but thrive. The wilderness, which seemed like a place of despair, became the backdrop for God's promise to unfold. This divine assurance reminds us that God can take what appears to be a dead end and transform it into a new beginning. God's blessing on Ishmael was both personal and generational. He declared that Ishmael would become the father of a great nation, a promise that echoed the covenant given to Abram. While Isaac was chosen as the line through which the Messiah would come, Ishmael's descendants were also destined for greatness. They would become a mighty people, spreading across vast regions and leaving an indelible mark on history. This shows us that God's purposes are multifaceted. He does not limit himself to one path or one group of people. His blessings flow abundantly, touching lives in ways that often surpass our understanding. The fulfillment of God's promise to Ishmael is seen in the 12 tribes that descended from him. These tribes grew into influential communities, shaping cultures and nations. Their legacy serves as a reminder that God honors his word, no matter the circumstances. Ishmael's life teaches us that being overlooked by others does not mean being forgotten by God. Even when society assigns labels or dismisses someone's value, God sees beyond appearances. He looks at the heart and declares each person worthy of his attention and care. What makes Ishmael's story so compelling is its universality. Many of us have felt like Ishmael at some point in our lives, caught between expectations, misunderstood, or pushed aside. But Ishmael's journey encourages us to trust that God has a plan for us, even if it doesn't align with the plans others have for our lives. His story invites us to embrace our unique identity and purpose, knowing that God values every individual. Moreover, Ishmael's blessing challenges us to rethink how we view others. Do we judge people based on their background, status, or perceived role in the bigger picture? Or do we recognize that everyone carries the potential for greatness under God's guidance? Ishmael's life calls us to celebrate diversity and acknowledge the contributions of all people, regardless of their origins. As we reflect on Ishmael's story, let us remember that God's promises are expansive. He blesses abundantly, not because of who we are, but because of who he is. Ishmael's legacy is a powerful reminder that God's love knows no bounds. It reaches the marginalized, uplifts the downtrodden, and transforms ordinary lives into extraordinary testimonies. Let this truth inspire you to live boldly, trusting that God has already written your story, one filled with purpose, hope, and divine favor. In a world that often measures worth by external standards, Ishmael's story stands as a beacon of hope. It reminds us that God sees beyond societal constructs and values, each person uniquely. Whether you feel overlooked, undervalued, or uncertain about your place in the world, know that God has a plan for you. Just as he blessed Ishmael, he desires to bless you, using your life to impact generations to come. So step forward in faith, confident that your story matters and that God is weaving it into something beautiful. Hagar's story is one of the most profound examples in history of how God remains faithful, even when circumstances seem to suggest otherwise. Her journey through hardship and abandonment reveals a truth that resonates deeply with all of us. God's promises and purposes for our lives remain intact, no matter how difficult the road may be. This is not just a historical account. It's a timeless message that speaks directly to the struggles we face today. Let me take you deeper into this powerful narrative and explore why Hagar's experience continues to inspire faith and hope in countless lives. When Hagar fled into the wilderness, she was not just escaping physical mistreatment. She was running from emotional pain, rejection, and the weight of feeling unseen. How many of us can relate to that? Life has a way of making us feel invisible at times, whether it's being overlooked at work, dismissed in relationships, or ignored by those who should care for us. The ache of invisibility cuts deep. But here's the remarkable part. While everyone else turned their backs on Hagar, God did not. In her darkest moment, He showed up, not with grand gestures or immediate solutions, but with His presence. An angel appeared to her, speaking words of comfort and reassurance. "You are seen," these words echoed. "Your pain matters. Your child will have a future." This divine encounter teaches us something extraordinary about God's character. He doesn't wait until our lives are perfect to step in. Instead, He meets us in the messiness, in the rawness of our brokenness. For Hagar, this meant more than survival. It meant restoration. It meant knowing that her life had value, that her son would carry significance, and that she was never alone. Imagine the shift in her perspective. One moment, she was convinced she had no worth. The next, she realized she was cherished by the Creator of the universe. That transformation didn't erase her hardships, but it gave her the strength to endure them. What makes Hagar's story so compelling is its universality. We've all faced moments where God's promises feel distant, where His plan seems unclear. Maybe you're walking through your own wilderness right now, a season of uncertainty, loss, or pain. Perhaps you're questioning whether God still cares, or if He ever intended anything good for you. If that's you, let Hagar's story remind you that God's timing is different from ours. His faithfulness isn't contingent on our understanding. It's rooted in His unchanging nature. Even when we can't see the path ahead, He is already there, preparing the way. Consider the promise given to Hagar about Ishmael. At first glance, it might seem small compared to the covenant God made with Abraham. But look closer. God blessed Ishmael abundantly. He became the father of 12 tribes, a nation with a rich legacy. What appeared to be a lesser role was actually part of a greater purpose. This challenges us to rethink how we view our own lives. Are we focusing too much on what seems lacking, instead of recognizing the unique calling God has placed on us? Hagar's story invites us to trust that God uses every detail of our lives, the highs and the lows, to fulfill His plans. Moreover, Hagar's faith wasn't passive. She responded to God's intervention by naming Him El ROI, the God who sees. This act of worship demonstrated her acknowledgement of God's presence and provision. It's a powerful reminder that faith requires action. When God reveals Himself to us, how do we respond? Do we cling to doubt, or do we choose to trust Him? Hagar's example encourages us to actively engage with God, to call out to Him in our need, and to recognize His hand at work in our lives. Ultimately, Hagar's story is a testament to God's relentless pursuit of us. No matter how far we wander, how deeply we hurt, or how forgotten we feel, He sees us. He hears our cries and responds with compassion. This truth should anchor us in every storm we face. It should give us courage to keep moving forward, even when the path is unclear. And it should inspire us to live with confidence, knowing that God's purposes for us cannot be thwarted. So, as you reflect on Hagar's journey, ask yourself, am I allowing God to meet me in my wilderness? Am I trusting His promises, even when they don't align with my expectations? Let her story challenge you to embrace the fullness of God's faithfulness. Because just like Hagar, you are seen, valued, and loved by the one who holds the universe together, and that changes everything. God's care for Hagar is a profound reminder of the inherent dignity and worth of every human being. Though she was a servant, an outsider, and someone society might have deemed insignificant, God saw her. He didn't just see her as a means to an end, or as someone whose value was tied to her role or status. Instead, he saw her as a person, worthy of love, attention, and compassion. This truth challenges us to rethink how we view others, and even ourselves. In a world that often measures worth by external achievements, wealth, or social standing, Hagar's story stands as a powerful counter-narrative. It declares that no one is too small, too broken, or too overlooked to be cherished by God. Hagar's experience in the wilderness forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how we treat those on the margins of society. How often do we dismiss people because they don't fit into our preconceived notions of importance? How many times have we failed to see the humanity in someone because of their job, background, or circumstances? Hagar was a servant, a position that placed her at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Yet, God chose to intervene in her life, not because of what she could offer, but simply because she mattered. Her story invites us to look beyond labels and recognize the divine image in every individual. It calls us to extend kindness, empathy, and respect to everyone we encounter, regardless of their station in life. What makes this aspect of Hagar's journey so compelling is its universality. We all long to be seen, to feel valued and understood. Imagine the weight of Hagar's emotions as she fled into the desert, carrying the pain of rejection and the uncertainty of her future. She must have felt invisible, as though her struggles were insignificant compared to the lives of those who held power over her. But then, something extraordinary happened. God met her in her pain. He didn't wait for her to prove herself worthy of his attention. He didn't demand that she rise above her circumstances before he extended his grace. No, he met her exactly where she was, in the wilderness, in her vulnerability, in her raw humanity. This moment between Hagar and God teaches us that true compassion isn't conditional. It doesn't require prerequisites or qualifications. True compassion sees the person behind the struggle and responds with love. When Hagar named God ROI, the God who sees, she wasn't merely acknowledging his omniscience. She was celebrating the fact that he noticed her when no one else did. That kind of divine attention transforms lives. It reassures us that we are never truly alone, even in our darkest moments. And it compels us to extend that same awareness and care to others. Consider the implications of this truth in our daily interactions. How different would our communities look if we made a conscious effort to see the people around us, not just their roles or titles, but their hearts? What if we took the time to listen to the stories of those who are often silenced or ignored? From the cashier ringing up groceries, to the immigrant working tirelessly to provide for their family, every person carries a story worth hearing. Every person bears the imprint of God's handiwork, deserving of honor and respect. Hagar's story also challenges us to examine our own sense of self-worth. Many of us struggle with feelings of inadequacy, believing that we need to achieve certain milestones or meet specific standards to be valued. But Hagar reminds us that our worth isn't determined by what we do or what others think of us. It is rooted in the simple yet profound reality that we are created and loved by God. When we embrace this truth, it frees us from the pressure to perform and allows us to live authentically, knowing that we are enough just as we are. Ultimately, Hagar's experience underscores the transformative power of being seen. When God met her in the wilderness, He didn't just change her circumstances, He changed her perspective. He showed her that she mattered, not because of her position or possessions, but because she was His beloved creation. This revelation gave her strength to face the challenges ahead and hope to believe in a brighter future. As we reflect on Hagar's journey, may we carry this lesson with us. Everyone has value. Everyone deserves to be seen. And everyone, including you, is worthy of God's boundless love. Let this truth inspire you to look deeper, love harder, and live more intentionally, knowing that every life is sacred and significant in the eyes of God. Hagar's life is a testament to the profound and often overlooked role that women play in God's redemptive plan. Her story is not just one of hardship and survival. It is a narrative of resilience, faith, and divine purpose. When we pause to reflect on her journey, we see a woman who was thrust into circumstances beyond her control, yet emerged as a figure of enduring significance. Hagar's life challenges us to rethink the contributions of women throughout history, especially those whose stories are overshadowed or dismissed, and recognize their vital place in shaping the future. At first glance, Hagar might seem like an unlikely candidate for such a pivotal role. She was a servant, an outsider, someone with little agency or power in the ancient world. Yet, God chose her, a woman without status, without privilege, to carry forward His promise. This choice speaks volumes about how God values people, not based on societal hierarchies, but on their inherent worth as His creations. Hagar reminds us that God does not measure worth by titles, wealth, or influence. Instead, He sees the heart, the potential, and the unique purpose within each individual. Through Hagar, we learn that no one is too small, too insignificant, or too marginalized to be used by God. What makes Hagar's story even more compelling is her response to adversity. Faced with rejection, betrayal, and isolation, she could have succumbed to bitterness or despair. But instead, she turned to God. In the wilderness, when all seemed lost, she encountered Him in a deeply personal way. It was there, in her lowest moment, that she named Him El Roi, the God who sees. This act of naming reveals something extraordinary about Hagar. Despite her pain, she recognized God's presence and acknowledged His care. Her faith did not erase her struggles, but it gave her strength to endure them. Hagar teaches us that faith is not about having all the answers. It is about trusting God even when the path ahead is unclear. Hagar's legacy extends far beyond her immediate circumstances. Though she was not the matriarch of the promised line, her son Ishmael became the father of 12 tribes, fulfilling God's promise that he would be the ancestor of a great nation. This detail underscores an important truth. God's plans are vast and inclusive. He works through multiple streams, weaving together diverse stories to accomplish His purposes. Hagar's inclusion in this grand narrative shows us that God's blessings are not limited to a select few. They overflow to encompass all who trust in Him, regardless of their background or position. Moreover, Hagar's life highlights the critical role women play in shaping generations to come. She may not have been celebrated in her time, but her faith and perseverance left an indelible mark on history. Her courage in the face of adversity serves as a model for women today. In a world that often diminishes the voices and contributions of women, Hagar's story calls us to honor and uplift their roles in every sphere of life. Women are not merely supporting characters in God's story. They are central figures, entrusted with the task of carrying hope, love, and redemption into the world. As we reflect on Hagar's journey, we are invited to consider our own roles in God's unfolding plan. Are we allowing fear, doubt, or societal expectations to limit what we believe we can achieve? Or are we stepping into the fullness of who God has called us to be? Hagar's example encourages us to embrace our unique gifts and trust that God will use them for His glory. Whether we stand at the center of attention or labor quietly behind the scenes, our lives matter. Every act of faithfulness, no matter how small, contributes to the larger tapestry of God's work in the world. Hagar's story also invites us to celebrate the diversity of God's family. Through her, we see that God delights in using people from different walks of life to fulfill His purposes. Her inclusion in Scripture reminds us that God's kingdom is not monolithic. It is richly textured, reflecting the beauty of humanity in all its forms. As we engage with others, let us strive to see them as God sees them, valuing their unique perspectives and contributions. Ultimately, Hagar's life challenges us to live with greater awareness of God's presence and purpose. She reminds us that even in our most difficult moments, we are seen, loved, and valued by the Creator of the universe. Let her story inspire you to walk boldly in your calling, knowing that God uses ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. May we, like Hagar, leave a legacy of faith that impacts generations to come. As I reflect on Hagar's story, I am struck by the profound simplicity of her experience. Her life was far from perfect, yet it was in her brokenness that God revealed His unwavering presence. It makes me wonder, how often do we overlook the divine in our own struggles? In moments when we feel abandoned or unseen, it is easy to assume that God has forgotten us. But Hagar's journey reminds us that God sees us even when we cannot see Him. This truth challenges me to reframe my perspective during difficult seasons, to trust that God is working, even when His hand feels hidden. The key takeaway from this story is clear. God's faithfulness transcends human limitations. He cares for the overlooked, provides for the needy, and fulfills His promises in ways that defy our expectations. Hagar's life teaches us that no one is too insignificant to be part of God's greater plan. Whether we find ourselves in the wilderness of uncertainty or facing rejection, we can hold fast to the assurance that God sees us, hears us, and walks with us through every trial. But let this not just be a lesson we admire from afar. Let it move us to action. I urge you to take a moment to reflect on your own life. Where do you need to see God's presence more clearly? Are there areas where you've doubted His care or questioned His purpose? Let Hagar's story inspire you to seek Him anew. Engage in conversations about faith, doubt, and resilience. Question long-held beliefs that may have kept you from embracing the fullness of God's love. And perhaps most importantly, extend compassion to those around you who feel unseen or undervalued, just as God did for Hagar. May this story linger in your heart, reminding you that you are never alone. God sees you, He loves you, and He has a purpose for your life, even in the wilderness. Let that truth propel you forward, inspiring hope, courage, and a deeper connection with the One who truly sees.